The gentle PAW the first time Sarah felt the bobcat's paw reach for her hand. Something ancient stirred inside her soul. A primal recognition between two species that should have been strangers, yet somehow weren't. Her breath caught as the large, padded paw rested gently in her palm, warm and trusting against her skin. She hadn't expected this when she'd driven 8 hours to the remote Montana town of Aspen Creek, following rumors of a most unusual resident at the local mercantile. But here she was, locked in a moment of impossible connection with 45 pounds of wild predator whose amber eyes seemed to hold generations of wilderness wisdom. In that suspended moment of contact, Sarah felt the weight of her grief, the crushing loss that had driven her to this desperate pilgrimage, begin to shift ever so slightly, as if the bobcat understood something about healing that humans had long forgotten. If you enjoy the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Sarah had first heard about Gus 3 months after burying her husband. The article appeared in her social media feed like a sign, a bobcat rescued as a cub who now offered his paw to strangers. She'd stared at the photo for hours that night, unable to explain why the image haunted her. James would have loved this story, she thought, remembering how her husband had always been drawn to tales of unlikely connections. The cancer had taken him quickly, too quickly for proper goodbyes, leaving a void that echoed through their cabin in the Colorado mountains. Wildlife had been their shared passion, countless hikes spent tracking elusive creatures through the underbrush. James had possessed an almost supernatural ability to spot animals others missed, his patient stillness rewarded with rare glimpses of creatures in their natural habitat. The secret, he'd always whispered, is to stop trying to find them and instead let them find you. Now, 6 months into her widowhood, Sarah found herself standing in Miller's Mercantile, waiting to meet the bobcat who had drawn her across state lines. The store smelled of pine, leather, and thyme, wooden shelves stocked with practical necessities for rural living. Mr. Miller, a weathered man with kind eyes, watched her carefully as she stood nervously in the center of the store. "He'll come when he's ready," the shopkeeper explained, arranging canned goods on a shelf. "Gus has always made his own decisions about people." Sarah nodded, pretending she wasn't desperately pinning impossible hopes on this encounter. She wandered the aisles, examining fishing lures and mason jars, feeling foolish for the emotional weight she'd placed on meeting a wild animal. What had she expected? That a bobcat would somehow heal the jagged edges of her grief? That the touch of a wild paw would answer the unanswerable questions left in death's wake? An hour passed, then another. Customers came and went, some casting curious glances her way. Sarah began to accept that perhaps Gus wouldn't appear today, that perhaps this journey had been another attempt to outrun a pain that traveled with her wherever she went. Just as she was reaching for her car keys, a rhythmic thump sounded from the back room. The wooden floorboards creaked under significant weight. Around the corner came Gus, moving with the fluid grace that made bobcats such effective hunters in the wild. He was larger than she'd imagined, his muscular frame carrying the dignified presence of apex predators. His fur was a magnificent tapestry of tawny brown spotted with black, his distinctive ear tufts alert and expressive. But it was his eyes that stopped Sarah's breath, amber pools of intelligence that seemed to assess her completely in an instant. Mr. Miller continued stocking shelves as if a wild predator wasn't casually strolling through his store. "Let him come to you," he advised without turning around. "Don't reach out first." Sarah stood frozen, heart thundering so loudly she was certain the bobcat could hear it. Gus approached with deliberate steps, neither hurried nor hesitant, his gaze never leaving her face. He circled her once, his whiskers twitching as he processed her scent. Sarah remembered James's words about letting animals find you, and she focused on breathing evenly, on projecting calm she didn't feel. When Gus finished his assessment, he sat directly before her, his tail sweeping once against the wooden floor. Then, with a movement that appeared both practiced and somehow deeply personal. He raised his right paw and held it suspended in the air between them. Sarah slowly extended her hand, palm up, afraid to hope yet unable to resist the invitation. The weight of his paw settling into her hand sent a current of emotion rushing through her body. The simple, trusting gesture broke something open inside her, a dam of grief she'd been holding back for months. Silent tears streamed down her face as she stood connected to this wild being who had no logical reason to trust humans yet chose to do so anyway. "He doesn't do this with everyone," Mr. Miller said quietly from behind the counter. "Some folks wait all day and leave disappointed." Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't move, afraid to break the fragile connection. Gus kept his paw in her hand for nearly a minute, his eyes never leaving hers. When he finally withdrew it, Sarah felt the absence like a physical pain. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure if she was addressing Gus, Mr. Miller, or some larger force that had guided her here. Gus blinked slowly, a gesture cats reserve for those they trust, then turned and padded away, disappearing back into the private areas of the store. "Coffee," Mr. Miller offered, gesturing toward a pot brewing behind the counter. "I think you might need a minute." Sarah nodded gratefully, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted the steaming mug. "How did he come to be here?" she asked when she could trust her voice again. Mr. Miller's face softened with memories. "Found him 7 years ago, just a tiny thing caught in an illegal trap up in the hills. His front leg was badly damaged, would have died out there if my grandson hadn't heard his cries. The wildlife rehabilitator said he'd never survive in the wild with that injury. We were prepared to send him to a sanctuary, but Gus had other ideas. Kept breaking out of every enclosure, finding his way back here. After the 3rd time, we figured he'd made his choice." Sarah sipped her coffee, imagining the trust it must have taken for a wild creature to choose human companionship. "Has he always offered his paw to people?" she asked. Mr. Miller smiled. "That started about 5 years ago, completely on his own. We never trained him to do it, wouldn't even know how. First time was with my late wife, Martha. She was having a rough day with her arthritis, sitting right where you are now. Gus walked right up and put his paw in her hand. She said later it was like he knew exactly where her pain was worst." Sarah's throat tightened as she thought of James, of his unwavering belief in the intelligence and empathy of wildlife. "Would it be all right if I came back tomorrow?" she asked, already dreading the return to her empty cabin. "Store opens at 8, Mr. Miller replied with a knowing look. "Gus is usually most social in the mornings." Sarah found herself returning to Miller's Mercantile every day for the next week. She rented a small room above the town's only diner, extending her impromptu visit day by day. Each morning, Gus would appear at different times, sometimes immediately as she entered, sometimes keeping her waiting for hours, but he always came eventually and always offered his paw. On the 4th day, Sarah brought her sketchbook, something she hadn't touched since James fell ill. As Gus lounged on a patch of sunlight near the wood stove, she began to draw him, her fingers remembering the joy of creating. Mr. Miller watched approvingly from behind his counter. "Martha always said that Bobcat was put on this earth to heal people," he commented during a quiet moment. "Never quite believed it myself until now." By the end of the week, Sarah had filled nearly half her sketchbook with studies of Gus, his powerful shoulders, the distinctive pattern of his fur, the intense focus of his gaze. On her 7th day in Aspen Creek, a heavy snow began falling in the early afternoon. The few customers in the store hurried home before roads became impassable. Mr. Miller began closing early, flipping the sign on the door and counting the register. "You might want to head back to the diner before this gets worse," he advised Sarah. "Weather report says we're in for 18 inches by morning." Sarah nodded, reluctantly gathering her things. Gus had been unusually aloof that day, watching her from distances but not approaching. As she buttoned her coat, disappointment settled heavy in her chest at missing their daily connection. Just as she reached for the door handle, a familiar thump sounded behind her. She turned to find Gus sitting directly in her path, his paw already extended. This time when she took it, he tugged slightly as if asking her to follow. Sarah looked questioningly at Mr. Miller. "Well now, that's interesting," the shopkeeper murmured. "I'd follow if I were you." Gus led her toward the back of the store, past the stockroom to a door she hadn't noticed before. He waited patiently as Mr. Miller came forward to unlock it, revealing a narrow staircase. "My living quarters," he explained. Gus has never invited a customer up before. Heart pounding with the strangeness of it all, Sarah followed the Bobcat up the stairs into a cozy apartment. The space was simple but homey, worn leather furniture, bookshelves packed with volumes, and walls covered with photographs. Gus padded directly to a specific photograph on the mantelpiece and sat before it, looking back at Sarah expectantly. She approached slowly, somehow knowing before she even saw it what she would find. The photograph showed a much younger Mr. Miller standing beside a tall, lanky man with familiar eyes, James's eyes. "That's my grandfather," Sarah whispered, touching the frame with trembling fingers. "With my brother Eric," Mr. Miller confirmed, wonder in his voice. They worked together on the conservation project in Yellowstone back in the 70s. "Eric Miller," Sarah said, the connections clicking into place. "My husband's family talked about him often, the Miller who taught them all to track and respect wildlife." "Your husband?" Mr. Miller asked, his weathered face lighting with sudden recognition. "James Evans. Martha and I went to their wedding, must be 15 years ago now. We lost touch after Martha got sick. I never made the connection when you gave your name. Evans is common enough." Sarah stared at the photograph, at the wild twist of fate that had led her here. "James passed 6 months ago," she said softly. "Cancer." Mr. Miller's face fell. "I'm so sorry. He was a good man just like his grandfather." Gus made a soft churring sound, pressing against Sarah's legs. "How could he possibly know?" she whispered, looking down at the Bobcat. Mr. Miller shook his head. "Martha would say some things can't be explained, only experienced." She believed Gus could sense what people needed most. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the world in silence. "You'll stay here tonight," Mr. Miller decided. "The guest room is small but warm. Seems like you were meant to find your way back to family, one way or another." That night, Sarah slept more peacefully than she had in months, lulled by the quiet creaks of an old building and the occasional soft footfalls of Gus patrolling the apartment. In the morning, she called the diner to check out her room, then helped Mr. Miller shovel the walkway to the store. When they opened for business, Sarah found herself naturally falling into the rhythm of the place, helping customers find what they needed, sharing stories of Eric and James with old-timers who remembered them. 1 week stretched into 2, then a month. Sarah called her sister to have more clothes sent, unable to explain why she couldn't leave just yet. Her sketches of Gus expanded to include the town, the mountains, the daily life of Aspen Creek. For the first time since James's diagnosis, she felt the spark of purpose returning. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in early spring. A young woman entered the store, her face drawn with grief, eyes haunted in a way Sarah recognized immediately. "I read about the Bobcat online," the woman explained hesitantly to Mr. Miller. "My daughter, her voice broke. "We lost her 3 months ago. Someone said this place helped them. That maybe," she couldn't finish. Sarah approached gently, recognizing the desperate hope that had brought her here as well. "His name is Gus," she said softly, "and sometimes he knows exactly who needs him most." As if summoned by her words, Gus appeared from between the aisles, making directly for the grieving mother. Without hesitation, he sat before her and raised his paw. The woman's sob echoed through the quiet store as she knelt and accepted the offered connection. When she finally rose, something had shifted in her expression. Not healing, not yet, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that healing might someday be possible. "He knew," she whispered to Sarah. Somehow he knew. Later that evening, as Sarah helped close the store, she shared the idea that had been forming for weeks. "I think this is important," she said to Mr. Miller. "What Gus does, it matters to people. I've been thinking about writing a children's book about him, with illustrations. A story about grief and healing and unexpected connections." Mr. Miller considered this as he swept the wooden floors. Martha always said Gus had a purpose bigger than just keeping an old shopkeeper company. She'd approve. Sarah worked on the book through the summer and into fall, her artistic skills returning stronger than before. She interviewed locals about their experiences with Gus, creating a narrative that wove together many stories of healing. The book found a publisher more easily than she'd expected. Something about Gus's story resonated deeply with everyone who heard it. When advance copies arrived at the Mercantile the following spring, Sarah placed one in Mr. Miller's hands with nervous anticipation. His eyes misted as he turned the pages, taking in her illustrations capturing Gus's dignity and gentle spirit. "You've done right by him," he said finally. "James would be proud." The book's success surprised everyone except perhaps Gus himself, who accepted the increased visitors to the store with his usual discerning eye. Some received his paw, others simply his watchful gaze. Sarah found herself receiving letters from around the country, stories from readers who found comfort in the tale of the healing bobcat. On the anniversary of James's passing, Sarah sat on the porch behind the Mercantile, watching the sunset paint the Montana mountains in shades of gold and purple. Gus lounged beside her, his substantial weight leaning comfortably against her leg. "I never expected to find my way forward here," she told him, scratching gently behind his ears. "Never imagined my healing would come through a bobcat's paw." Gus blinked slowly up at her, that deliberate feline gesture of absolute trust. As if to emphasize the point, he placed his paw directly over her heart, a gesture he'd never made before. Sarah covered his paw with her hand, feeling the impossible connection between them, predator and prey, wild and tame, healing and healed. Later that evening, as stars emerged over the mountains, Sarah made a decision she'd been considering for months. "I'd like to stay," she told Mr. Miller over their customary evening coffee. "Permanently. Help with the store, continue writing. The cabin in Colorado, it holds too many ghosts." The old man smiled. "Been hoping you'd say that. This place is too much for one person my age. Martha would have liked the idea of it staying in the family, so to speak. Besides," he added, glancing at Gus snoozing by the wood stove, "I think he's made his preference clear." When the second book was published a year later, Sarah dedicated it to both James and Martha, who understood that healing often comes from unexpected connections. The series grew to include 5 books, translated into dozens of languages, bringing visitors from around the world to the small Montana town. Some came in crisis, bearing fresh grief. Others came in curiosity, seeking the famous paw. Gus received them all with the same inscrutable wisdom, offering his connection to some, maintaining his distance from others. The day Gus turned 15, well beyond typical bobcat lifespan, the town of Aspen Creek held a celebration in his honor. Children who had grown up with his presence brought handmade cards and offerings of his favorite treats. Elderly residents who remembered him as a rescued cub shared stories of his early days at the Mercantile. Sarah, now a permanent fixture in town and officially Mr. Miller's business partner, watched with pride as Gus accepted the attention with his usual dignity. That night, as the store emptied of celebrants, Mr. Miller turned to Sarah with a serious expression. "Been meaning to ask something important," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "I'm not getting any younger. Been thinking of retiring, turning the place over to you entirely. If you're willing." Sarah looked around at the store that had become her home, at the community that had embraced her, at the unlikely path that had led her here. "I'd be honored," she replied simply. Mr. Miller nodded, satisfied, figured as much. "One condition, though," he pointed to the store sign visible through the window. "Think it's time for a change." The following morning, a new sign was unveiled above the Mercantile's entrance, "The Gentle Paw." Beneath it, a beautifully painted portrait of Gus, his paw extended in that familiar gesture of connection. As years passed, Sarah watched Gus slow with age, his jumps less graceful, his naps longer. Mr. Miller retired to a small cottage behind the store but visited daily, often sitting for hours with his old friend. Gus continued his selective offering of connection, somehow always finding those who needed it most. When Gus finally passed at the remarkable age of 18, an almost unheard-of lifespan for his species, the entire town mourned. Cards and letters poured in from around the world, from people whose lives had been touched by his story, his presence, his gentle paw. Sarah buried him on the hillside behind the store, in a spot where sunshine pooled each morning. Mr. Miller stood beside her, both of them silent in their grief for a being who had changed the course of so many lives. 3 days later, as Sarah opened the store, she found a tiny bobcat kitten sitting on the front porch. No mother in sight, no signs of injury, just a small spotted ball of fur watching her with intelligent eyes. The wildlife officials who examined the kit could find no explanation for its presence, no reported bobcats with litters nearby, no reason why a mother would abandon a healthy kitten. Almost like he was left for you to find, the ranger said, scratching his head in confusion. The kitten, a female they named Martha, adapted to life at the gentle paw with uncanny ease. She explored the store with confidence, claimed Gus's favorite sunny spots, and watched customers with the same discerning gaze. On the anniversary of Gus's passing, Sarah sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar golds and purples. Martha lounged beside her, growing quickly into her wild heritage. Just as Sarah was about to rise, Martha did something unexpected. She sat up, looked directly into Sarah's eyes, and slowly, deliberately, extended her paw. Sarah accepted it with tears streaming down her face, feeling the wheel of connection turn full circle. The legacy of the gentle paw would continue. In a world that often emphasized the boundaries between species, between wild and tame, a simple gesture of trust had created ripples of healing that continued to spread outward. Sarah had come to Aspen Creek broken, searching for something she couldn't name. She had found not just healing but purpose, not just memories but future. The most profound connections she had learned often came in forms we never expected, sometimes even in the touch of a wild paw offered freely in trust. These connections reminded us that grief and healing, like all of life's great journeys, were never meant to be traveled alone. And in the spaces between species, between words, between heartbeats, the most profound truths could be exchanged without a single word being spoken. Sometimes, all it took was the courage to extend a hand, and the wisdom to recognize when a paw was being offered in return. If you enjoy the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.